Hello, and welcome to Dan Curtis's 1973 version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm Rodney Hill, professor of film in the Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra University. I'll be speaking with you today on a number of topics, including the stars of the show, Robert Foxworth, Susan Strasberg, and Bo Swenson, as well as Mary Shelley's source novel and some of the other adaptations. But I want to begin with the producer and co-writer of this production, Dan Curtis, who lived from 1927 to 2006. Curtis's proudest achievements came later in the 1980s with the acclaimed miniseries The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, both based on Herman Wouk novels. War and Remembrance won Curtis an Emmy Award, shared with co-producer Barbara Steele, for Outstanding Miniseries. But prior to that, in the 1960s and 70s, Dan Curtis made a number of forays into Gothic horror, mystery, and the macabre on television and on the big screen. In discussing Dan Curtis and horror, we have to take into account as a point of departure his best-known work, the daytime serial Dark Shadows, which ran on ABC from 1966 to 1971. If you're a fan of that show, many things about this adaptation of Frankenstein may seem quite familiar to you. In its beginnings, Dark Shadows blended the soap opera format with Gothic drama and romance, along the lines of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. But gradually Dan Curtis and his staff of writers wove in elements of the supernatural, eventually introducing a 175-year-old vampire character named Barnabas Collins, played by Jonathan Frid. Ratings soared, and the show continued in the horror vein with witches, werewolves, seances, time travel, and even a variation on the Frankenstein monster. Dan Curtis produced and directed two motion picture adaptations of Dark Shadows in the early 1970s, House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows, both co-written by Sam Hall, Curtis's writing partner on this version of Frankenstein. Both Dark Shadows films were released theatrically through MGM, and they starred members of the TV cast. When Dark Shadows went off the air in 1971, it soon took on a second life as it went into syndication, the first soap opera ever to do so, and it has continued to attract new audiences in the ensuing decades thanks to VHS, DVD, and now streaming. In 1991, Dan Curtis remade Dark Shadows as a nighttime drama on NBC, but that series lasted just one season. There was an attempt to reboot the show in 2005 with an unaired hour-long pilot. And of course you may be familiar with Tim Burton's film version in 2012, starring Johnny Depp, which strikes a tone quite different from the original. As of the recording of this commentary, there is some talk of a possible new version of Dark Shadows, but we will have to wait and see if that reincarnation comes to life. We should note that even when he was dealing with limited budgets, as with this version of Frankenstein or with Dark Shadows, Dan Curtis strove to treat the material in a serious manner, never intentionally camping it up. And this quotation from Milton lends an added dimension of literary prestige to the production on top of the explicit reference to Mary Shelley in the opening title earlier. A few of Dan Curtis's collaborators from Dark Shadows contributed to this production of Frankenstein, notably the composer, Robert Cobert, who lived from 1924 to 2020 and wrote the music for virtually every Dan Curtis production. Dark Shadows fans already will have recognized the music cues, as they are entirely borrowed from Dark Shadows, or, more accurately, from Dan Curtis's 1968 TV movie, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Much of Cobert's score for that production was repurposed on Dark Shadows beginning in 1968 and then reused again here, as well as in the movie House of Dark Shadows. A best-selling 1969 album of Cobert's Dark Shadows music, some of which had been borrowed from Dr. Jekyll, spent 19 weeks on the Billboard charts. Another of Dan Curtis's collaborators from the old Dark Shadows days was writer Sam Hall, who lived from 1921 to 2014. In the 1950s and 60s, Hall had several plays optioned for Broadway but never produced, and he found work writing for television. In 1952, he married the stage actress Shirley Grayson, who then took on the stage name Grayson Hall. She received an Academy Award nomination for her supporting role in John Huston's 1964 film Night of the Iguana, and the next year she appeared in Disney's That Darn Cat. Grayson Hall had a long and successful career in film, television, and the theater up until her death in 1985, but she is best known for her work on Dark Shadows, beginning in 1967. Shortly after Grayson Hall had joined the cast, Dan Curtis hired her husband, Sam Hall, who quickly emerged as one of the show's head writers, ultimately authoring 318 episodes. Hall wrote several other projects for Dan Curtis, including the two Dark Shadows movies in the early 70s and the 1991 Nighttime Revival series, along with his son, the novelist Matthew Hall. After Dark Shadows, Sam Hall continued to write for daytime television on One Life to Live, Santa Barbara, and Another World. His work has garnered 2 WGA awards and numerous Emmy nominations. The director, Glenn Jordan, born 1936, was a protege of Dan Curtis, who had previously directed several TV movies and would go on to enjoy a long and successful career as a director and producer. Jordan's other notable credits include Curtis's TV version of The Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as the TV movie version of Les Miserables, 9 episodes of the acclaimed series Family, Sarah Plain and Tall, and O Pioneers. Even though Frankenstein was not directed by Dan Curtis, it still bears much of his signature look as previously established with Dark Shadows and Jekyll and Hyde. In just a few moments, we'll turn our attention to the lead actors in Frankenstein, Robert Foxworth, Susan Strasberg, and Bo Svensson, but right now I want to mention John Carlin in the supporting role of Otto, since he only appears in these early scenes, and he represents one more Dark Shadows connection. Carlin, who lived from 1933 to 2020, was much beloved by Dark Shadows fans for his portrayal of Willie Loomis, the feckless servant of the vampire Barnabas Collins, along with several other characters, in a total of 179 episodes. Carlin also appeared in the motion pictures House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows. He was a regular fixture at Dark Shadows fan conventions over the years, where he was known for his rascally, roguish sense of humor. In addition to Frankenstein, his other work for Dan Curtis includes The Picture of Dorian Gray, Melvin Purvis' G-Man, co-written by John Milius, The Invasion of Carol Enders, Trilogy of Terror, and The Winds of War. John Carlin's other feature film credits include Pennies from Heaven, a 1986 adaptation of Native Son, and the European vampire film Daughters of Darkness, starring Delphine Seyrig. A Brooklyn native, Carlin studied for 2 years at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, the father of Susan Strasberg. He also trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, class of 1958. John Carlin's Broadway debut came in 1960 when he replaced Rip Torn as Tom Jr. in Sweet Bird of Youth, when Torn took over the lead role originated by Paul Newman. Later on Broadway, Carlin appeared in Invitation to a March and The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore. His other stage credits include Marat Sade, Caligula, and Prometheus Bound. Aside from Dark Shadows, John Carlin is best known for portraying Harvey Lacey, the stay-at-home husband of the Tyne Daly character on Cagney and Lacey. For that role, Carlin won an Emmy in 1986 for Best Supporting Actor in a Dramatic Series, with 2 additional nominations in 1985 and 1987. He revived the role in a few Cagney and Lacey TV movies in the 1990s. John Carlin's extensive television credits from the 1950s to the 1990s also include Kraft Television Theater, Naked City, Route 66, Night Gallery, Mod Squad, Kojak, Hawaii Five-0, All in the Family, Starsky and Hutch, The Waltons, Trapper John M.D., Fame, Hill Street Blues, Mad About You, and Murder, She Wrote. Here we are introduced to the characters of Victor's father, Alphonse, lifelong friend Henry Clerval, and fiancée Elizabeth, played by Susan Strasberg. This development provides a good moment to begin considering some of the ways that this adaptation relates to Mary Shelley's novel, originally published in 1818 and revised in 1831, in which all 3 of these characters are more fully fleshed out. One notable difference lies in the fact that Elizabeth in the novel had been adopted into the Frankenstein family as a sister or cousin figure to Victor during his childhood, with his parents intending her also to be his future bride. This aspect of the narrative no doubt played quite differently in 1818 and 1831 than it might have in 1973 or indeed today. In this scene, what may seem like a minor detail, Elizabeth's letter, represents a clever allusion on the part of Dan Curtis and Sam Hall to the novel's different approach to storytelling. Shelley initially follows the epistolary form, that is, her story begins with a series of letters from an explorer named Robert Walton to his sister, and later we find further letters from other characters written to Victor. Walton writes to his sister of his chance meeting with Victor Frankenstein while trekking through the Arctic regions. Frankenstein tells Walton of his family background, childhood, friendships and studies, his growing interest in chemistry, electricity, and the source of life, and eventually of the creation of the demon, as Victor calls the giant. Within this extended flashback of sorts, narrated by Victor, he tells Walton of his own conversations with the creature, in which the giant explains to Victor how he came to learn to speak and read, among other things. Such a nested structure of flashbacks within letters may work very well for a novel, but not necessarily for a film or a TV movie. Like virtually all motion picture adaptations of Frankenstein, with the notable exception of the 1994 Branagh Coppola film, Dan Curtis's version dispenses with the framing story of the Arctic explorer, as well as the letters and flashback structures, instead opting for a more linear, classical Hollywood approach of cutting back and forth between Victor's story and that of the giant, as we shall see going forward. The scenes in Frankenstein's laboratory constitute a significant departure from the source novel, which avoids any specifics on how the creature is brought to life, although it does imply the use of chemistry, alchemy, and electricity in the process. Here is how Mary Shelley describes the moment when the life force animates the creature, told through Victor's narrative voice. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So the details of the laboratory and the explicit use of electricity via a lightning storm, which have become part and parcel of all Frankenstein adaptations, including the 1994 version, owe more to James Whale's 1931 film and its sequel than to the original novel. Some film historians have further suggested that such imagery finds its roots a few years earlier in Fritz Lang's 1927 masterpiece, Metropolis, which would inform virtually every mad scientist's laboratory to come, with its bubbling beakerfuls of chemicals, various electrodes, and arcing electrical sparks as Rotvang strives to give life to his robot version of Maria. This particular lab recalls storylines in Dark Shadows involving various experiments conducted by Dr. Julia Hoffman, played by Grayson Hall, including the creation of a Frankenstein monster knockoff called Adam, played by Robert Rodin, and his intended mate, Eve, played by Marie Wallace.
Trying to think. I can't. I keep remembering you.
Another trope that we find in most film and TV versions of Frankenstein, including this one, is a little narrative tease in which the experiment initially appears to have failed, resulting in a moment of suspense as the audience must wait a bit longer for the creature finally to come to life. Of course, none of this occurs in Shelley's novel. But it's important to remember that films work differently than novels, and the process of adaptation often requires making adjustments for the more visually oriented and time-bound medium of motion pictures. As Victor and Otto leave the lab, we get a very effective moment of cinematic narration as we witness an event that they do not. One final lightning strike sends an added jolt of electricity into the creature, bringing him to life, a development as yet unknown to anyone but us viewers. This tactic creates a nice lead-up to the commercial break, accompanied by a flourish in Bob Cobert's score. Incidentally, Dark Shadows frequently employed such cliffhangers, especially at the end of each episode, leaving audiences in suspense until the next day's show. We're still waiting in eager anticipation for Victor to discover that his creation is alive. When he does, we find another important departure from the novel. Again, a difference seen in most film and TV versions of Frankenstein, in which Victor is elated at the success of his experiment. By contrast, in Shelley's version, in that moment, Victor's attitude changes instantly to disgust and horror at what he has done. Once again, the novel presents the scene through Victor's voice as he relates the events later to the explorer Robert Walton. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. Not only do we get quite a different reaction from Victor on screen here, but we also see quite a contrast in the depiction of the creature, or the giant, as he is called in the credits, portrayed by the 6'5" Bo Svensson. Granted, Svensson's initial facial expressions, combined with the makeup effects, lend the giant a certain grotesque quality at times, but little effort is made to conceal the physical attractiveness of the actor himself. In fact, this rather coy scene teases us with the possibility of brief glimpses of nudity, which of course we never would see on network television, even late at night. No doubt you have noticed by now that Robert Foxworth also brings a considerable degree of attractiveness and charm to his portrayal of Victor Frankenstein, giving the character a level of appeal not always seen in other film and TV versions. In these scenes, we see the potential of Frankenstein to become a sort of father figure to the creature, making Victor, at least for the moment, a more sympathetic character for us. Many of the novel's references to Frankenstein's own childhood, as well as that of Elizabeth, and the importance of parent-child relations are missing from this version. So this scene of Victor's parenting of the creature, as it were, introduces at least a reference to those themes. Part of the tragedy here is Victor's unwitting, forthcoming abandonment of his creation and of his own responsibilities as creator. Otto remarks that the creature is like a baby, a giant baby, and Victor compares him to a 4-year-old, suggesting quite a rapid rate of development. This idea foreshadows a number of later scenes in which we see the giant learning and adapting rather quickly to the world around him. Throughout this production, we are witnessing some really fine performances, including, of course, Robert Foxworth's star turn as Victor. Robert Foxworth, born in 1941, has had a decades-long career on the stage and in film and television. He is best known for his starring role on the steamy nighttime soap opera Falcon Crest in the mid-1980s. Additionally, Foxworth directed 12 episodes of that series, which also starred Jane Wyman, Lorenzo Lamas, and coincidentally David Selby, who was a key member of the Dark Shadows cast from 1968 to 1970. Falcon Crest was produced by Lorimar Productions for CBS to build on the tremendous success that they had achieved with the pioneering nighttime soap Dallas and its spin-off Knots Landing. Robert Foxworth originally was being considered for the role of villainous J.R. Ewing on Dallas, which eventually went to the brilliant Larry Hagman. Foxworth had asked the producers how the ruthless J.R. could be made more sympathetic, and when they told him, "Yeah, that's not going to happen," he bowed out of the running. This anecdote proves useful in understanding Foxworth's approach to the role of Victor Frankenstein. He brings to the character a level of ambiguity not often seen in earlier film and TV adaptations. Of course, it is easy to blame Victor for going too far in his ambitions, bringing tragedy upon himself, his family and friends, and even the creature itself. Yet he retains in Foxworth's admirable performance an appealing level of humanity, which certainly is not diminished by Foxworth's charm and good looks. Robert Foxworth first turned to acting as a youth at the Alley Theater in his hometown of Houston, Texas. He later studied acting formally at Carnegie Mellon and then spent 3 seasons as a member of the resident company of Arena Stage in Washington, a prominent regional theater whose members also have included Diane Wiest, James Earl Jones, Jane Alexander, and Roy Scheider, among others. Foxworth later went on to work with the American Shakespeare Festival. In 1972, Theater World named Foxworth as one of the season's most promising players on Broadway for his portrayal of John Proctor in Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Foxworth's theater background serves him well here, and we could say the same of Susan Strasberg and John Carlin, as this TV movie version of Frankenstein has a distinctly theatrical feel, which Foxworth and Carlin discuss in their 2004 commentary with Jim Pearson, also available on this release. Although Frankenstein was a single-camera production shot on videotape, its visual style, notably the use of long takes, mimics the live-on-tape approach of Dark Shadows, which at its best achieves the dramatic qualities of live theater. Speaking of theatricality, in the most positive of connotations, we are coming up on another scene with Susan Strasberg as Elizabeth, so now would be a good time to go into some of her background. Susan Strasberg was born in 1938 and lived until 1999. She was the daughter of Actors Studio artistic director Lee Strasberg and the actress Paula Miller, another prominent acting coach. Susan Strasberg made her off-Broadway debut at the age of 14 and by age 17 was starring in the original Broadway production of The Diary of Anne Frank. Within 3 months, her name was in lights above the title on the marquee, and in 1956, she won a Tony and a Theatre World Award for that performance. When Susan Strasberg was in her late teens, Marilyn Monroe, then 29, undertook the serious study of acting with both Lee Strasberg and Paula Miller. Marilyn was virtually adopted into the household, and she and Susan became longtime friends. Strasberg wrote about her memories of Monroe in a 1992 book called Marilyn and Me, Sisters, Rivals, Friends. We will come back to Susan Strasberg shortly, but for now I want to turn our attention to this scene between Otto, played by John Carlin, and the giant, played by Bo Svenson. We will get into some of the details of Svenson's career in good time. You will note that the wardrobe here fairly well fits in with the typical look associated with the monster, as established in the James Whale Boris Karloff films of the 1930s. But there are a couple of other more interesting aspects of the scene that I want to consider. First of all, we find a fairly subtle bit of writing and performance after the creature has learned to speak the name of Otto. Carlin's character walks away to return to his work, but the giant follows and taps him on the shoulder, pointing to him and repeating, Otto, as if he now expects to be taught his own name. The fact that the creature has no name, neither here nor in the source novel, indicates his rejection by his maker, Victor Frankenstein. This scene also echoes but contrasts the Adam storyline from Dark Shadows, in which, for reasons too complicated to explain here, the vampire Barnabas Collins and his ally Dr. Julia Hoffman create a variation on the Frankenstein monster. They leave the creature, Adam, to the tender mercies of Barnabas's servant Willie Loomis, played by John Carlin. Willie has a criminal past and furthermore is afraid of Adam, leading him to treat Adam with cruelty and aggression. Here, Dan Curtis and Sam Hall give Carlin the chance to play the same scenario, being left to care for the creature, in a totally different light, as Otto shows kindness and patience, even a growing fondness toward the giant. These interactions provide John Carlin an excellent opportunity to shine as an actor, and it is easy to see why fans still love him, even though he is no longer with us.
Play, yes. Oh, good. That's very good.
The end of the scene echoes another Dark Shadows strategy in its abrupt transition to a completely different mood, as the creature suddenly takes hold of Otto and, not realizing his own strength or what it means to kill, squeezes the life out of him. This action sets up a pattern that will recur at various points in the story, with the creature shifting suddenly from a docile, even childlike demeanor to one of sometimes inadvertent violence.
Stop it! How about December 25th? Will you marry me then?
Let's take this opportunity to fill in a few more details on Robert Foxworth, whose television career began in the late 1960s with appearances on The Mod Squad, Mannix, Hawaii Five-0, and other prominent series. Foxworth got into TV movies in the early 1970s, including this version of Frankenstein, of course, as well as The Devil's Daughter, which, by the way, featured Jonathan Frid of Dark Shadows fame. Foxworth made guest appearances on a number of series, including Columbo, Boston Legal, Bones, The West Wing, Law & Order, Gilmore Girls, and a few of the various iterations of Star Trek. He had a recurring role on 6 Feet Under, in addition to many other TV appearances. Notably, in 1990, Robert Foxworth starred in the TV movie Face to Face alongside the great Elizabeth Montgomery. They were then married until her death in 1995. Foxworth's feature films include Damien Omen 2, Prophecy, and Airport 77, and he has done voice work for several of the Transformers movies, along with a good deal of other audio work. I must say that I have been pleasantly surprised with Bo Svensson's performance as the giant, especially in these early scenes where he has minimal dialogue. I'm reminded of that great line by Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard, "We had faces." A few words on Bo Svensson. He was born in 1941, though some sources say 1944. To be honest, I have found some difficulty in finding consistent, reliable information on Svensson's life prior to his acting career, partly because he himself seems somewhat wary of the whole Hollywood publicity apparatus. According to some sources, Svensson left his native Sweden at the age of 17 and moved to Wisconsin, where he worked on a cousin's farm before joining the United States Marine Corps, where he served from 1959 to 65. After his military service, Svensson eventually fell into acting. His first TV role was on Flipper in 1965, and in the late 1960s, he had a recurring role on the hit series Here Come the Brides as the lumberjack Olaf Big Swede Gustafsson. Svensson then segued to TV longforms, appearing in The Lost Treasure, 1971, and The Bravos, an ABC Western in 1972. He also appeared in episodes of Mission Impossible, Daniel Boone, Ironside, High Chaparral, The Rookies, Mod Squad, and several other series before this role in Frankenstein. Bo Svenson is a working actor to this day, having appeared in more than 120 films and television productions. In 1975, he founded Magic Quest Entertainment, a Hollywood-based film and television production company of which he is the CEO. He is also the CEO and principal owner of Can-Am Film Corporation, a British Columbia film and television production company. A major boon to Svensson's career came in 1975 with the motion picture Walking Tall Part 2, when he replaced Joe Don Baker as Tennessee lawman Buford Pusser. Another Walking Tall sequel followed, as well as a TV series. Other notable films include The Great Waldo Pepper, North Dallas 40, Kill Bill, and Inglourious Bastards. In recent decades, Bo Svenson also has turned to writing and directing.
Strap. Very good. You will.
Earlier in this scene, we have witnessed Victor's first realization of the horror that he has created, which the character in the novel experiences immediately. Although these scenes are not present in Shelley's original, they do convey some of her themes, one of which casts Victor as an inadequate father figure who essentially abandons his creation. I find it interesting that the giant learns 3 words from his creator here: dead, Victor, and strap. This scene and the next also convey, in what we might experience as a darkly comic turn, Victor's lack of foresight in pursuing his mad ambitions. On a whim, he decides to tie down the creature without considering the potential emotional trauma to the childlike giant, even comically teaching him the word strap. The irony of Victor's moral hypocrisy comes across when he says, "When you know right from wrong, I won't strap you down." Very clever writing on the part of Sam Hall. Victor's thoughtless actions continue in the next scene with his careless conveyance of Otto's body, barely concealed in a canvas sack, again providing a moment of dark comedy as Victor is almost caught by 2 intoxicated women in Otto's apartment house. The fact that Victor is saddled with disposing of Otto's body emphasizes his complicity in the eventual destruction of virtually everyone near and dear to him. Even before the bodies start to pile up, Victor shuts out his friends and loved ones, first for the sake of the experiment, and then in his attempts to cover up his deeds. As we bid farewell to Otto, it is worth mentioning that such a character, Frankenstein's assistant, a fixture in most film and TV adaptations, does not appear in the novel at all. Rather, this figure seems to stem from the 1930s films, or perhaps from a popular stage adaptation from the late 1920s. I mention this and other departures not as a criticism, not to imply that there is some fault in Dan Curtis and Sam Hall's deviations from Shelley's source material, but simply to suggest that audience expectations by 1973 had been shaped more by the Karloff films than by the novel. Furthermore, even if it might be possible to hew closely to the original novel in a film adaptation, as Kenneth Branagh and Francis Coppola did in 1994, it might not always be to a film's advantage to do so. Shelley's rambling story, often expounding on Victor's internal states of mind, takes place across several years, encompassing 24 chapters and well over 300 pages, depending on which reprinting you're reading. As such, it requires a good deal of rethinking, rearranging, even rewriting to make an effective motion picture. Nonetheless, Dan Curtis's telefilm of Frankenstein does include a number of elements from the novel not found in earlier films, giving some credence to his claims that this version represented the most faithful adaptation up to that time. We'll have more to say about these aspects of the Curtis production a bit later on. As Susan Strasberg, playing Elizabeth, re-enters the storyline, let's turn our attention back to her career. Susan Strasberg made her television debut in 1953 at the age of 15. The next year saw her film debut with Vincent Minnelli's The Cobweb and another supporting role in Picnic, based on William Inge's Pulitzer Prize-winning play. Strasberg's first starring role on film came in 1955 opposite Henry Fonda in Sidney Lumet's Stage Struck, a remake of the 1933 film Morning Glory, which had earned Katharine Hepburn an Oscar.
I'll come home as soon as I can, within a week or two, when my experiment is finished. Then everything will be as it was. Come, I'll take you back to the inn.
We're not leaving, Victor.
In 1957, Susan Strasberg once again starred on Broadway in Time Remembered alongside Helen Hayes and Richard Burton, with whom Strasberg embarked upon an intense but short-lived relationship.
Have a little talk. Alone.
Susan Strasberg continued working on the stage, but in the long term, her career didn't live up to its early promise. Later on, she appeared in several low-budget horror films, some for American International Pictures.
I think you owe me an explanation of your behavior.
Her performance and screen presence here attest to the great acting talents that Susan Strasberg still possessed. Even if other productions were not making full use of them, this one certainly does.
Oh, Elizabeth, you can't believe that.
Henry, I'd really like to be alone just for a few minutes.
These scenes of characters wandering around in the woods at night, barely missing each other, and with this sort of veiled threat of the monster lurking, reminds me a lot of Dark Shadows, where often you'll see characters wandering in these obviously constructed woods at night with very limited visibility, a character lurking in the shadows. In this case, it's a bit of a red herring, but meant to introduce the possible threat that the creature poses to Elizabeth. This is a bit of foreshadowing that will pay off, unfortunately, later on in the story. And in the novel, indeed, Victor Frankenstein comes to realize, really too late, that the creature poses a threat not only to him, but to his friends and family as well. Now that the paths of the creature and Victor are diverging somewhat, we start to move a bit closer to the structures of the novel. Recall that in the novel, Victor is initially horrified. As soon as the creature comes to life, Victor's whole attitude changes from being enthusiastic about the prospects of creating life to one of abject horror. He is just immediately repulsed and horrified by the creature, and he flees from the laboratory or wherever this is supposed to have taken place. Again, we don't get very much detail in the novel about exactly how he breathes life into the creature, but Victor is so terrified that he retreats to his room and has a fitful night of sleep. And at some point the next morning, the creature sort of peeks into his room, and that's really the last, the only encounter between them until much, much later in the novel. So pretty much as soon as the creature comes to life, the very next day, he leaves Victor, and Victor does not see the creature for a couple of years in the novel. So that's one difference. But now at this point, once we see that the creature played by Bo Swenson here has left Victor's realm and is out on his own, this version of Frankenstein starts following a bit more closely some of the aspects of the novel. These scenes of the monster out in nature, discovering heat and fire and the dangers of fire, but that fire can be a good thing, discovering rain and water versus fire, discovering sunlight. All of this is part of the process of learning that the creature tells to Victor in the novel. Once they do encounter each other some 2 years later, the creature relates his adventures, his process of discovering the world, his process of coming into a kind of self-awareness and consciousness. All this is related to Victor much later in the novel. So it's interesting that in this version, Dan Curtis and Sam Hall have chosen, I think wisely, to edit these things together so that we don't have to wait until near the end of Victor's story to find out what happened with the creature. So this is given to us much more in a kind of linear fashion, as we would expect from a sort of classical Hollywood approach to storytelling. So what we see now is a kind of condensation of some of the things that the creature later describes to Victor in the novel. His various encounters with people, with birds, animals. So this little moment with the bird, I don't think specifically appears in the novel, but it's very well done here. The creature begins to understand that he can inadvertently kill another creature. He's reminded of Otto. So this shows that he's able to make mental connections. He has memories. He's able to learn from his past deeds. The transition from the bird to William, the younger brother of Victor Frankenstein, is a very clever little bit of foreshadowing on the part of Dan Curtis and his collaborators here, the director and the writers. Because later on, of course, the monster does pose a threat to William. And transitioning into this brief scene of these children playing also, again, hints at the potential threat that the monster poses, not only to people in general and to children, but also to William. Incidentally, this one kid that runs back up to the creature is played by future teen idol Leif Garrett, who has a nice little brief role here in Frankenstein. Now, these little inserts of Elizabeth and Henry, we'll see Elizabeth with Victor later on, these really serve primarily to remind us that all this while Victor is not aware of what's going on with the monster. Victor is worried about what's happening, but it also allows for a passage of time. There's quite a lot of time goes by in the novel, and so these scenes provide a very economical way of showing a passage of time. We get the idea that the monster is out in the world for a considerable amount of time and he's wandering, and then we see another encounter with random people, and he approaches these people with a friendly look on his face, and their immediate reaction to him is one of violence. So this conveys something that is indicated in the novel, that the creature has found his encounters with human beings to be far from ideal, and he finds that people are hostile towards him, and as yet he doesn't really understand why. Now we're entering upon a section of the film that does really introduce something from the novel that often is left out of most of the adaptations. The creature happens upon this house inhabited by a family. We learn their name is DeLacy. And from prior film and TV versions, we might expect the encounter with a blind man. But here, Curtis and Sam Hall have decided to make the man's daughter, Agatha, blind. Obviously, from this shot of the father, he is not blind. The daughter is blind. And one of the reasons I think they made that change is that we're so familiar with the encounter of the creature with the blind man. They thought, well, why recreate that again? Let's do something different. And having the young woman be blind and be the one who the creature ultimately tries to make a connection with maybe hints at the possibility of a romantic interest, a romantic relationship between the two of them. Obviously, that never comes to fruition, but it's hinting at this desire of the creature, not only for friendship, but ultimately for romantic love, a heterosexual romantic love. Now, I think inadvertently, one thing that this does by changing the blind character from the man to his daughter, it undercuts the hints of homoeroticism that we find in the 1931 James Whale film and its sequel, the 1935 Bride of Frankenstein. Both of those have been identified as pretty heavily queer-coded in a way. But I think that aspect is James Whale's, that it's not something that has its origins in Mary Shelley. So here the switch of the blind character being the daughter doesn't really disrupt the Mary Shelley text as much as it maybe departs from the expectations that we have based on the James Whale film. This is an extended scene, a sequence in the film, multiple scenes in the home of the DeLacy family. Felix, the son, is engaged, and he's brought his fiancée, Safi. Here she is meant to be Spanish, and she speaks Spanish, but in the novel, she is Turkish and Arabic, and so there is, in both cases, there is a language barrier between Safi and the family. Again, we have these brief cutaways to Victor and Elizabeth, and these serve a couple of purposes. Number one, it reminds us that Victor is still concerned about the creature. He knows the creature is out there somewhere. Disaster may come at any moment, and he's really sort of put his life on hold until he knows what's happening with the creature. But those cutaways also, again, serve to allow a passage of time in between these scenes at the DeLacy house. So we are to understand that some time is passing as Agatha teaches Safi the basics of the language. In the novel, the DeLacy family is French, and so the creature, oddly enough, learns to speak and read in French, and the novel never fully explains how he's then able to communicate with Victor in English when they finally do reunite. So that's a complication that Curtis and Sam Hall avoid here by simply having Safi learning English, not French. As in the novel, the creature spends quite a lot of time in this storage room adjacent to the DeLacy household, observing, listening, and learning as Agatha is teaching Safi to speak and ultimately to read. And again, we see the passage of time, the mention of summer rain, soon it will be autumn, and even the little detail of the doll that he fashions to practice conversation with. In between those two scenes, we understand enough time has gone by that he's created the doll. So we go from this line of dialogue indicating soon it will be autumn, the creature asking what is autumn, to now Victor and Elizabeth talking about the fact that it's now October and they're looking ahead to November for their wedding date. So again, this is just a very economical way within a few scenes, within a few transitions, to show that quite a bit of story time has passed.
If everything's all right, we'll be married as planned.
Why shouldn't everything be all right?
No reason.
Henry breaks in with the news of villagers having seen and encountered this menacing giant figure. And Victor's reaction, his really over-the-top reaction, sort of betrays the fact that he's been keeping his emotions bottled up all this time. So he responds really very inappropriately, very harshly to Henry. And of course, Henry and Elizabeth have no idea what's going on, but we understand that Victor has been suppressing his worries and concerns, and now they're coming out in inappropriate ways. Again, more time has passed. We're talking now about plans for a wedding. And we see that Safi has been making progress, and the creature also is making progress in terms of learning language, learning about concepts such as home. He's learned the concept of friendship, and these are, of course, things that he longs for. So not only he's learned the concepts, but he's learned to desire these things.
Two. Nonsense, nonsense. It isn't often in this family that we can set a wedding date. Tonight?
The scene where the Lacys go out and leave the creature there is a nice way for him to rehearse what might happen when and if he decides that he wants to actually meet them. And this is, I think, one of the more touching scenes in terms of Bo Svensson's performance, as he is imagining himself in a social situation, imagining how polite society might react to him, imagining himself a part of a community of people, and just the simplest of interactions. It's really quite remarkable the way that he is reacting to these imaginary figures. It must be quite a challenge for an actor to perform a scene in this way. And it's nice to see what he's doing with his face, with his body language, with the dialogue, the very gentle delivery of the dialogue. And this contributes quite a lot to the humanity of the creature. This is another thing that sets Dan Curtis's version of Frankenstein apart from so many earlier versions, where the monster is this sort of barely, sort of semi-articulate, hulking threat who is always ready to go off into violence at the drop of a hat. Here we can see more of a potential for the human side of the creature, and it makes it much more of a tragic story. We see him simply as a figure that is misunderstood and rejected, not only rejected by society, but rejected by his maker, rejected by the sort of father figure of Victor. He's even imagining these awkward situations. He imagines himself being awkward in a social situation. It's a very nicely written scene, very well performed by Bo Svensson. As he makes his way gently and slowly across the room, he is articulating his own insecurities, trying to work out for himself why people have not been kind to him. He doesn't understand why people have treated him badly. And it's really revealing that he would use this practice conversation as a way to get in touch with his own feelings as a character. Extremely well done, I have to say, on the part of Bo Svensson. Just look at the way he's gesturing and what he's doing with his face. And then this wonderful moment, very nice framing, very nice blocking. It's tough to pull this off in a long take like this. Like, he has to hit the right mark. He has to transition to this sense of wonder as he first thinks that he's seeing someone else's hand before he realizes that it's a reflection of his own hand. Now, in the novel, I believe there is a point at which the creature sees a reflection of himself in a pool or a puddle of water and realizes the disfigurement, or the what he calls in this scene, what he calls the ugly face. And so that scene of smashing the mirror has a little bit of an antecedent in the Mary Shelley novel. We're approaching the 1 hour mark here, and so we're getting close to the conclusion of part one of the 2 nights over which this film or this telefilm originally aired on ABC. So in a way, we need this kind of climactic confrontation between Henry and Victor as a kind of recap of confronting all of the problems that have been going on with Victor. He's been distant, he's avoiding his family, avoiding his friends, and he's been obsessed with this other thing that they don't know anything about. He's shutting them out of his life. So this serves as a kind of recap of this inner conflict of Victor's and the way that it's impacting his relationships as a way to kind of lead us into the end of part one.
My feeling toward you, or my family. This is just a terrible time.
Another interesting aspect of this scene is the fact that Victor makes up this excuse that he's working on a story. He's telling Henry about, imagine a man had a brother who committed all these horrible acts, etc. So he's clearly trying to let Henry know about his concerns over the creature without revealing the truth of the situation. But to me, it's very interesting that couching it within a fiction is, in a sort of an oblique way, a reference back to the Mary Shelley story itself. One of the things about Shelley is that she'd suffered from a miscarriage at one point in her marriage to Percy Shelley, and eventually did have two children of her own. And so this sort of personal tragedy from her own life, some scholars have suggested that she works that into her narrative of Frankenstein. So the use of stories as a way to mythologize, in a way, the tragedies of one's own life, or the aspects of one's life that can't be faced directly. Perhaps they can be faced through a kind of narrativization or mythologizing. So it's a very self-aware gesture on the part of the writers, Dan Curtis and Sam Hall, especially when we consider the fact that this scene is entirely fabricated for this version. This conversation is not something that comes from Mary Shelley's novel. So these references to storytelling and to characters in a book, characters in a story that Victor supposedly is writing, is I think, a very self-aware gesture. Now we return to the home of the DeLacys, and again, some time has passed. We are now at the wedding party. And even though this scene doesn't really take place in this way in the novel, it is in keeping with all the observations that the creature makes of the life in the DeLacy household. And it continues to develop his desire to be a part of that kind of social atmosphere. It's interesting how the scene is used to create suspense in a way. It's pretty clear to us that the monster, the creature, don't really think of him as a monster, but that the creature is toying with the idea of making himself known to this family, and he's building up the courage to do so and thinking surely they will accept him. And Curtis and Sam Hall and the director leave open the possibility that he could just walk right in, having the door be open. And we get the impression that he is, in fact, on the verge of walking into the wedding party when, by chance, Agatha slips away from the dance and screams, and it's this momentary disruption that stops the creature from coming in. Very important sort of loaded bits of dialogue here where Agatha says, "I know what I can do and what I can't. I don't always remember sometimes." So that conveys one of the important thematic warnings of Frankenstein. the need for humanity to know our limitations and to observe those limitations.
Dance or have friends or marry or see.
We're still held in suspense as we see the creature in the background here observing. We're still not sure if he might not go into the wedding, but this was a wonderful bit of writing again when the father says to Agatha, "You don't want to spoil the wedding." And the creature understands that if he goes in, he would spoil the wedding. So this conveys very cleverly the fact that the creature is able to reason through things. He's able to contemplate the potential consequences of his actions. And so he thinks better of his plan to just barge into the wedding. This little scene where he likens the doll, which cannot see him, to Agatha, who cannot see him. This may be a little bit overdone. Maybe it's a little bit too obvious in, telegraphing what the creature is thinking. But then again, this is a TV movie, so I think we have to expect certain moments like this where it's all just laid right out there, like where he's saying what he thinks. But for the most part, this production allows the viewer to do that work on our own and to figure things out as the creature is figuring things out. Now, this scene is the ending of episode 1. So this would be the very end of the first night's broadcast as he says, "May I come in?" Then we would fade out and go to the end credits. This scene would be the first thing we would see after a recap on the second night's broadcast. So we would get a fairly extended recap, which may be included on this release, of the key scenes that we had seen in the first hour, and then we pick up the drama here as he enters the house and has this interaction with Agatha. I want to point out briefly that if we were watching this as it was originally broadcast, that is, if we pick up a second episode here at roughly the 1 hour and 5 minute mark, we would have seen a repeat of the opening credits. But on the second night's episode, there's another credit. There's an additional credit for a writer named Richard Landau, who is not mentioned in the credits at the very beginning of the first night's episode, which you saw at the beginning of this release. Richard Landau lived from 1914 to 1993. He had co-written a feature film called The Quatermass Experiment from 1955, and also a film called Frankenstein 1970, made in 1958, starring Boris Karloff as Victor Frankenstein, not as the monster. And Richard Landau had a lot of other film and TV work to his credits. And again, we actually don't see him credited in the opening of this, but he would have been credited in the second night's episode. So I did just want to briefly mention Richard Landau as a third writer, in addition to Dan Curtis and Sam Hall, for this production of Frankenstein. If you're familiar with the 1931 film starring Boris Karloff, this scene will seem very familiar. Except in the 1931 film, it's a blind man who befriends the creature. Here, it's the daughter of Mr. DeLacy, not Mr. DeLacy himself, who is blind. And that is a difference from the novel as well. So the novel involves Mr. DeLacy, the blind man, and we see his family. The creature observes Mr. DeLacy's family, but it is the father that the creature befriends or attempts to befriend in this corresponding scene in the novel. And I've mentioned earlier the decision to switch the character to be the daughter rather than the father. This allows Sam Hall and Dan Curtis to explore the possibilities that the monster is really desirous not only of friendship, but ultimately something more than that, potentially making a home with someone, finding a mate, seeking happiness together. So these things that they're discussing in this scene tie into the things that the creature is beginning to want for himself in his life. He tells her that he has no friends and almost confides to her that he was hoping that maybe they could be friends.
Where were you traveling when you stopped here?
To find some people.
You mean to find work?
The way that this scene plays out, at least in spirit, is pretty faithful to the essence of the novel, to this section of the novel. The creature speaks quite calmly with the blind man, Mr. DeLacy, who also has no reason to be afraid of him. So there does seem to be a real connection between the two of them. That comes across here, even though the particulars of the conversation are written for this version by Sam Hall, Richard Landau, and perhaps Dan Curtis. But the essence of the scene is pretty faithful to the source novel. And when we get to this moment where she's trying to see him, so to speak, with her hands, and the family enters, the abruptness of the family's reaction to the giant is pretty well in line with what happens in the novel. The creature has befriended Mr. DeLacy. The family returns suddenly, and they're horrified, and the family all run away from the creature, taking Mr. DeLacy with them, dashing any hope that he has of ever finding real friendship. In fact, the family not only leaves on that day, they move out. They vacate the house because they feel that their father is in such potential danger from the giant. And so the creature learns in the novel that the DeLacys are gone and they're not coming back. At various points, we've been discussing some of the differences and similarities between this version and the original novel, but I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about the author of the original novel, Mary Shelley, who lived from 1797 to 1851. Her novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, originally was published anonymously in 1818. But then in her introduction of the revised 1831 edition, which did carry her name, and this is the one most familiar to today's readers, Mary Shelley tells of a house party that she and her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, attended at the villa of their friend Lord Byron. The weather was bad, and so everyone sat around reading some recent translations of Gothic tales. And Lord Byron suggested that they each should write their own ghost story as a sort of challenge. These events, incidentally, form the basis for Ken Russell's wonderful 1987 film, very atmospheric film called Gothic, as well as the prologue for the 1935 film Bride of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley, in her introduction, said that the idea for Frankenstein came to her in a dreamlike state. Now, this is quite a romantic notion, I have to say, but it's also telling in its hints of what we would now recognize as psychological symbolism. In 1815, Mary Shelley had given birth prematurely to a daughter who died a few days later. In the next year, she gave birth to a son, William, and then in 1817, a daughter, Clara. This is the period in which she was writing Frankenstein, finished in 1817. Modern-day scholars are quick to point out the connections between Mary Shelley's personal life at the time and the novel's recurring themes of creation, as well as its motifs of parent-child relationships.
Good night, William.
Speaking of children, here we have William, the younger brother of Victor Frankenstein, a character that is present in Mary Shelley's novel. And you'll recall that her own son was named William as well. So we rarely see William as a character in film and TV adaptations of Frankenstein, and so his inclusion here is certainly noteworthy. The character is played by Willie Ames, who was born in 1960 and who did considerable work on television beginning in the early 1970s, throughout the 70s, 80s, and into the 1990s. He's best known for the series Eight is Enough, and then later on the series Charles in Charge. But he did quite a number of individual episodes across various series and then repeated episodes on a few other series. After a 6-year hiatus from acting, he has returned to that profession in recent years and, as of this recording, is still a working actor. This encounter that we're seeing between young William and the creature plays out quite differently here than it does in the novel, just in terms of the attitude of the giant toward Willie. In the novel, at this point, the creature knows who Victor Frankenstein is. He knows that Frankenstein is responsible for creating him and for making him in the form that he's in, this what he considers to be this very wretched form that he's in. And so at this point in the novel, the creature is seeking vengeance against Victor Frankenstein, and he specifically goes to Geneva in order to seek out the Frankenstein family. He meets William rather by chance and finds out that William is a Frankenstein, and in that moment in the novel decides that William will be his first victim. So it's a very deliberate killing on the part of the creature in the novel. Here, I think Dan Curtis, Sam Hall, and Richard Landau are clearly attempting to make the creature more sympathetic, more humane, more fully drawn character than we've seen in previous film versions. And so here we see the death of William played out as an accident, not an intentional killing, just to keep the consistency of our sympathies with the Bo Svensson characterization of the creature.
That man who was hurt, the one that they brought here for...
Turning our attention back to Mary Shelley for a moment, both of her parents were important radical writers of the 18th century. Her mother, the class-conscious feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who lived from 1759 to 1797, wrote the landmark work A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, which argues for the moral and practical value of educating women. Mary Shelley's father was the political philosopher William Godwin, who lived from 1756 to 1836, probably best known for his 1793 treatise, Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, which argues for the importance of equality and social change. Apropos of justice, Mary Shelley's novel contains a number of subplots not included in this version, nor indeed in most adaptations, concerning characters falsely accused of crimes. Young William's governess, who is mentioned but not seen here, is accused and convicted of killing William, having been deliberately framed by the creature. Even though Victor and Elizabeth are both convinced of the innocence of the governess, whose name is Justine in the novel, they're unable to rescue her from her fate of being executed for that crime. And so, in a sense, she becomes the second victim of the creature. After he has killed William, he has essentially set her up to be executed for that crime, and Victor is haunted by his own guilt by association, as it were, in terms of having created the giant who then committed these crimes. So in the Dan Curtis version, when we see Victor discovering William's body, we get to experience that guilt very directly as Victor is reacting in the moment. But in the novel, he's not even present when William's body is discovered. Rather, he learns about the death by way of a letter from his father. Another subplot from the novel that is not developed in this version has to do with Safi's father, whose reputation suffered irreparably due to a false accusation. And spoiler alert, near the end of Victor's story, he himself is mistakenly identified as Henry's murderer. Now, what's this transition coming up here?
His neck was broken. Choked to death.
Forgive me. I did not mean to do it. I could not help.
The way that's handled is so well done. As Victor explains that the child's neck has been broken, we fade to black, and as the screen is going black, we hear the voice of the creature saying softly, "Forgive me." And the screen holds black for a second or two as he continues speaking and asking forgiveness. And then we transition into the visuals of the creature sitting alone, essentially praying, but equally, we might say, asking himself for forgiveness, trying to come to grips himself with what he's done and with the fact that he did not intend to kill William. So this scene really demonstrates in a very nice way that the creature has developed a conscience. He's developing a soul, as it were. And that little gesture of using the black screen, using the soft voice of Bo Svensson to get us into that transition, is a great example of the kind of magic that Dan Curtis often created along with his collaborators on his various productions, including this one. You know, throughout this production, I've been waiting for the opportunity to talk about the look of the production in general. By today's standards, by 2025 standards, this may seem a bit old-fashioned, but it isn't, by the standards of the time. The fact that it's shot on video, it's shot entirely in studio and on backlots. All the interior sets were shot at the old MGM studios, which are now the Sony studios in Hollywood. And these exterior shots are on the old MGM backlot, which doesn't exist anymore. This production, which was shot in 1972 and aired in 1973, was one of the very last productions to be shot on the old MGM studio backlot from the sort of glory days of the Hollywood studio system, if we want to call them that. So this is kind of the last connection back to the old Hollywood studio days and the look that we got from those old Hollywood productions. There is a kind of artifice to everything that I think is actually really wonderful. You know, one of my colleagues at Hofstra University, Bill Jennings, who teaches filmmaking, cautions our students against what he calls the tyranny of realism. You know, these days we expect everything to be absolutely realistic, as if any motion picture or television or digital production is realistic. But we have a certain standard of realism that we tend to apply to everything, expecting it to look like it was shot today on somebody's iPhone or something like that. But I think there's a tremendous value in a visual sense of artifice that's a kind of equivalent to saying once upon a time, right? Yeah, yes, this is staged. This is performed. These people are telling us a story, and these visuals put us right into that experience of living inside a story for a couple of hours. And it's kind of fun to immerse ourselves, I think, into this artificial fantasy world of the story. And so this is something that can be achieved with this studio look, the backlot look, and I think even the fact that it's shot on videotape contributes to that. And I've talked earlier about the long take aesthetic, the use of these unbroken shots that go on and on. Quite often, much of an entire scene is captured in a single run of the camera, and it lends a kind of theatrical quality to the production, as if we are watching a live theatrical production. You can imagine this being done on stage. And that, again, that taps into the kind of appeal that I'm seeing here. That is, we know we're being told a story, right? When we go to the theater to see a play, we know, I mean, we never think that we're actually seeing the characters in their lives. It's always obviously a production, a performance that is being put on for us as this company of people gathers to tell us a story. And that is the kind of approach that we find in Dan Curtis's best work. And I'm really falling in love with this production the more that I watch it, and going back and rewatching it for the commentary. It really has grown on me quite a bit, and I think it's very charming. In a way, it feels like watching an extended 2-hour episode of Dark Shadows. And what that series often achieved for me and its many fans is a similar kind of live drama quality that I mentioned earlier. And also, somewhere I read, maybe this was a Dark Shadows fan, or maybe one of the cast members or one of the writers who was trying to explain the strange appeal of something like Dark Shadows, 60 years now after the series premiered. And we might say the same of the appeal that this production of Frankenstein, now 52 years after it aired. I think it's a similar kind of appeal. Watching Dark Shadows and watching this production is like living in a Gothic novel. And not just anybody can give us that experience, and Dan Curtis certainly was somebody who could. And I just love the studio-bound quality of this, the sets, the exteriors on the backlot. It's really a marvelous production.
Children scream with terror. You can't blame yourself.
This confrontation between the creature and Victor Frankenstein is played out here much in the same fashion as it occurs in the novel, and it's a bit different than what we see in some of the earlier film adaptations of Frankenstein. But one difference is that in the novel, at the point some 2 years after his creation, when the creature does catch up to Victor Frankenstein and confront him, by that time, the creature has become really well-read and well-spoken, and he is speaking to Frankenstein about philosophical issues. He's speaking rather eloquently. He's talking about the fact that he has read philosophical works and histories, and he has read Milton, which reminds me again of that opening quotation in this production, the title card with the quotation from Milton, maybe an indirect nod to the fact that in the novel, the creature by this point has read Milton. So it's a different kind of conversation on a different level than the one that's being had here. But at its base, it's touching on the same core issues that Victor has created the giant in this form. He's made him ugly. He's made him wretched. And people don't like him. And even Victor himself has rejected him. And so these are the same core issues that the monster in the novel is addressing with Victor. But here, I don't think we would buy into the same level of articulateness from the creature that we find in the novel. So I think it's a wise decision on the part of Dan Curtis, Sam Hall, and the other writers not to have the giant speaking on some higher level of language, because we wouldn't be able to accept that drastic a change in Bo Swenson's performance. So the demands of wanting a mate, again, this is something that comes from the novel, and we're getting to that point right now where the monster agrees to go away and leave Victor alone and leave all of humanity alone if Victor will create a mate for him. So this is right out of the original novel, and we're familiar with the idea of a sort of bride of Frankenstein because of the 1935 sequel by James Whale. But in the novel, as in this production, the story of the bride of the monster, or the bride of the creature, plays out quite differently, as we'll see later on. But for now, I'll just point out that we're certainly very well familiar with the marvelous portrayal of the bride figure in the 1935 film by the great Elsa Lanchester. And I would add that in the Dark Shadows Frankenstein story, the story of the Adam character, we get a very similar kind of situation where Adam demands that Barnabas and Julia create a mate for him. Otherwise, he will start killing the people who are near and dear to them. They eventually give in to his demands, even though they're quite troubled by the prospects, the morality of it. They really don't think it's a good idea, but they go along with his demands and create this character, this intended bride character called Eve, played by Marie Wallace. Well, in Dark Shadows, much as in The Bride of Frankenstein, Eve rejects Adam and becomes sort of a nemesis for him briefly until that storyline gives way to another different story. At that point, gradually, the Dark Shadows story moves into a variation on the turn of the screw, as Dan Curtis was wont to do, borrowing from all the classic Gothic tales in his Dark Shadows series. I hope we'll have time to discuss some of those other narrative lines of Dark Shadows that come from other Gothic tales. But for now, I want to get back to the moral quandary that Victor is facing in meeting the demands of the creature. For Victor to have any moral compass at this point seems a little bit absurd, because in creating the giant in the first place and giving life to this being, he seemed to set aside any sort of moral questions at all, and only is dealing with the morality of that after the fact. And so now he's faced with sort of a double-edged moral question. On the one hand, if it was immoral to create the creature in the first place, how can he even consider creating a second one? But now that he has created the giant, doesn't he owe the giant something? Isn't he sort of obliged to give the giant a mate? So it's a sort of unresolvable moral quandary for Victor in moving ahead here. So in creating the mate for the giant, we get a little bit of a repeat of the grave robbing. We get a little bit of a repeat of the laboratory scenes, and we see the body of a woman on the table with stitches on her face. And this reminds me, I know it doesn't really make sense to ask questions of plausibility in a story like this, but why do the parts have to come from different bodies? I never really understood that about the Frankenstein story. If Victor can reanimate a dead body, why does it have to be pieced together from a lot of different sources? But that's it. I know that's a silly question because that is the story, and it really doesn't have to make sense.
Victor marries you, will I be your father-in-law?
Make a wish, Papa.
I'd like to get back to the producer Dan Curtis, who by the 1970s had established himself as one of the major names in genre television. Curtis had wanted to put together his own series of the classic Gothic tales, as he had done on Dark Shadows with its various storylines. You'll recall that Dark Shadows was a daytime soap opera which ran every day, Monday through Friday, for half-hour episodes. And that series had borrowed from Jane Eyre, The Legend of the Phoenix, Dracula, The Crucible, Frankenstein, The Turn of the Screw, twice, werewolf lore on multiple occasions, The Picture of Dorian Gray, The Monkey's Paw, Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Rebecca, and Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, among other stories. So clearly, Curtis had a creative affinity for the Gothic. Prior to Frankenstein, Dan Curtis's other forays into the TV movie format had included The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1968, starring Jack Palance, and The Night Stalker from 1972, starring Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak, a tabloid reporter investigating paranormal stories. Both of these aired on ABC in prime time. The Night Strangler, a follow-up to The Night Stalker, premiered in prime time the same night as Frankenstein ran in the late-night slot, January 16th of 1973. Incidentally, there was a short-lived Kolchak TV series the following year, but Dan Curtis was not involved in that production. Dan Curtis had been planning a classic Gothic theater series for prime time, which was to include Frankenstein as well as The Picture of Dorian Gray and Wuthering Heights. But by the early 1970s, ABC had started to move away from videotaped content in prime time, so the late-night programming of ABC's Wide World Mysteries presented a way for Curtis to get these Gothic projects done on low budgets. And at that point, Dan Curtis relocated from New York to California in 1972. Other projects that he completed for the late-night Wide World Mystery series included The Turn of the Screw, starring Lynn Redgrave, a really very nice adaptation, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Shadow of Fear, The Invasion of Carol Enders, Come Die With Me, and Nightmare at 43 Hillcrest. Another of Dan Curtis's best-known productions was a made-for-TV movie, which also aired on ABC, Trilogy of Terror. Best known, perhaps, for the marvelous segment, terrifying, in fact, starring Karen Black as a woman who is terrorized by a miniature warrior doll that comes to life and attacks her. Really, the stuff of nightmares. Another really nice Gothic production, produced and directed by Dan Curtis, was a 1976 theatrical movie called Burnt Offerings. This is a feature film starring Karen Black, Oliver Reed, the great Bette Davis, Burgess Meredith, and Eileen Heckert. And in a way, it reminds me a bit of Dan Curtis's movie Night of Dark Shadows from 1971. It concerns a haunted house and the inability of a family to escape the house. Members of the family become possessed by the ghosts that are haunting the house, and the ghosts will not really allow them to leave. It's kind of a variation on Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. So we might see an oblique kind of adaptation, not really, but certainly an influence there by Shirley Jackson's work on the work of Dan Curtis. And that film, Burnt Offerings, again, it was made for movie theaters, but it had quite an afterlife on re-airings on network television and late-night TV and so forth. So another really marvelous Gothic production by Dan Curtis in the 1970s. Let me back up here and give you just a little bit of the TV industry context for the rise of the TV movie in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Beginning in the 1960s, the three major television networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, began programming recent Hollywood films in prime time. Prior to that, you would not have seen theatrical films shown on network television. By the early 1970s, the networks were presenting multiple primetime movie nights. NBC also began producing made-for-TV movies in the 1965 to 66 season, and 1969 saw the introduction of the ABC Movie of the Week. By 1972, the made-for-TV movie was a well-established component of the network's primetime programming, and Dan Curtis saw this format as a way to realize his plans for a series of Gothic dramas. As I mentioned earlier, this production of Frankenstein aired in the late-night time slot. ABC had tried various strategies to compete with NBC's Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, first with the introduction of The Joey Bishop Show from 1967 to 69. Then ABC moved Dick Cavett's talk show from daytime to late night, and they also introduced this sort of checkerboard programming, which they called ABC's Wide World of Entertainment, an umbrella that included a lot of specials, a variety of programming, with dramas falling under a secondary umbrella branded as Wide World Mysteries. Dan Curtis was one of several producers who provided content for these Wide World Mysteries, including a rerun of his Jekyll and Hyde, shown as a two-parter, as was the case with Frankenstein. ABC's late-night smorgasbord programming ran through 1975. They would also re-air some of the ABC Movie of the Week programming that had been shot on film for primetime, like Night Stalker, Night Strangler, and Trilogy of Terror.
Henry, you don't understand.
Oh, but I do understand.
So we find ourselves now back in the lab and returning to the creation of the mate for the giant. This confrontation with Henry doesn't take place like this in the novel. Henry never really learns of Victor's experiments, even though the two characters do spend considerable time in the latter part of the novel traveling together, and Henry does become one of the victims of the creature. But here he's an interesting foil, and this writing allows the scene to articulate the moral quandary that Victor finds himself in a way Henry is speaking as Victor's conscience here, and allowing Victor to play off of those moral objections that Henry raises. Otherwise, it's a very internal monologue that we find in the novel as Victor is wrestling with these moral questions. So the use of Henry as a kind of moral sounding board here and his condemnation of Victor is pretty effective. So the scene of the creation of the mate here is somewhat faithful to the novel, and it departs from the earlier bride stories in the movies and even on Dark Shadows. In the novel, Victor gets to the point of creating the mate as he does here, although again in the novel we really don't see the lightning, the electrical sparks, and the details of how he brings the creature to life. But he does get to the point of being ready to proceed and bring the mate to life. But in the novel, he rips apart the body that he has put together, that he has assembled. I mean, tears the body apart in a rather gruesome scene as it's described in the novel. Certainly not something that could have been done effectively on a budget on video in 1973. Not that I don't think it would have passed standards and practices in any case. And so instead of tearing the body apart, Victor allows too much electrical charge to basically burn up the body. And it's a very effective visual when we see right here the smoke rising off the body. And Victor confirms for the monster that he just couldn't go ahead with this. It was the wrong thing to do. And as in the novel, the creature, the giant, vows that he will get his revenge, and significantly that he will be with Victor on his wedding night. That's a motif that's repeated. It's a line that's repeated with quite a lot of emphasis in the novel. I will be with you on your wedding night. And in both the novel and this adaptation, Victor fails to understand the full importance of that threat. He mistakenly thinks that it simply means the creature will come for him and kill him on his wedding night. But we know that he means more than that.
I am alone. I will destroy all that you love.
I'd like to say a few more words about some of the adaptations of Frankenstein over the years. The 19th century saw a number of stage productions, and a successful theatrical revival in 1927 may have spurred the interest of Universal Studios in eventually producing their 1931 version, which we have considered at various points. Numerous sequels followed, even including the parodic Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Later on, Hammer Films, who essentially remade the old Universal horror classics in color and with more blood, gave us a number of Frankenstein-related pictures from the 1950s to the 70s, including The Curse of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and the deliciously titled Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. All in all, depending on how we count them, the Frankenstein monster has appeared in well over 230 film and TV productions since 1910, when the first known film version appeared, produced by Thomas Edison's company. Certainly a very small percentage of these make any serious attempt to follow Mary Shelley's novel closely. Those that do include this version and the 1994 film starring Robert De Niro, which we have discussed.
What's happened?
Elizabeth, there's no time. You must leave now.
Not without you. I'm not going anywhere without you.
The first television version of Frankenstein, broadcast live in 1952, apparently survives on Kinescope, although I have not seen it. An episode of ABC's Tales of Tomorrow, it starred Lon Chaney Jr. as the monster, a role he had played on the big screen in The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942. In 1973 alone, the year in which this version originally aired, at least 3 other Frankenstein movies appeared. Andy Warhol's Flesh for Frankenstein, starring Joe D'Alessandro and Udo Kier, Jess Franco's Italian horror film / sexploitation flick, The Erotic Rites of Frankenstein, and another TV movie that aired on NBC called Frankenstein: The True Story, starring James Mason, Leonard Whiting, and David McCallum. That version often overshadows this one due to its higher budget as it was shot on film and its prime-time airing. Even so, Dan Curtis's version got some respectable reviews. The LA Times says, Frankenstein is the best shot yet in ABC's ongoing war to woo the midnight audience. Despite a minuscule budget, Frankenstein is quite a handsome show, with huge, foreboding sets and a splendid array of special effects. Variety called it extraordinary entertainment, and continued to say Frankenstein marks a decided step forward in late-night entertainment. It's really too good to relegate to the Insomniacs.
Victor, we could be married right here.
One of the dangers in doing a commentary track like this is that one gets carried away and ends up talking over a really notable scene, and that just happened to me. So about a minute or two ago, if you can rewind and rewatch it, the scene where Victor and Elizabeth arrive at their hotel by carriage at night, to me, that is straight out of Val Lewton. It really calls to mind the marvelous film The Body Snatcher, starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. The atmosphere, the rain-slick streets, the shadows, the long shots of the wide shots of the coach approaching seems almost, it's got to be a direct reference to the Val Lewton horror films of the 1940s, which are not as well known, maybe, as the Universal horror films of the 30s, but the Val Lewton RKO horror films of the 1940s are some of the best and most literate horror films ever produced in America, and if you're not familiar with them, I urge you to seek them out. Val Lewton was the producer of 9 horror films in the 1940s, the early 1940s, early to mid-40s, produced at RKO, including the original Cat People, but also things like Bedlam and I Walked with the Zombie, some of the greatest films with some of the worst titles ever in history. And I can't help but think that Dan Curtis must have seen those films and must have appreciated their gothic sensibility, and that scene as Victor and Elizabeth arrive at the hotel really calls to mind that sort of horror noir characteristic of the Val Lewton films. Speaking of noir, a few minutes prior to that, there's a wonderful scene as the creature breaks into Henry's room to kill him. We see the landlady sort of going up the staircase, and the way that staircase is lit is just brilliant, the sort of chiaroscuro lighting that we associate with film noir. So Dan Curtis and his collaborators know very well what they're doing in terms of Hollywood filmmaking history and how to use visual style effectively to convey a kind of gothic mood. For audiences in 1973, the way that Dan Curtis, Sam Hall, and Richard Landau construct the ending of their version of Frankenstein must have seemed quite surprising because it was so unlike any other versions that had been seen before in its faithfulness to Mary Shelley's novel. In the novel, Henry Clerval is killed by the monster, by the creature. Elizabeth is killed by the creature. And spoiler alert, I mean, we're near the end here. You've probably seen the ending already, but you're going to make it. Both Victor and the creature die in the end. We don't see that in the well-known film versions of Frankenstein, partly because we need to leave open the possibility of a sequel. Even in the 1930s, filmmakers and studios were thinking of sequels and continuing the series. But for Mary Shelley, writing in 1817, a novel published in 1818, this is still a fairly early modern novel. I mean, the modern novel is a phenomenon that arises in the 18th century. So the notion of a novel setting up a sequel was unheard of. And so you have this very tragic ending in the novel where everybody dies, basically. And we don't ever see that in most film and TV adaptations of Frankenstein. Here we do. And this is one of the ways in which Dan Curtis and his collaborators have maintained a certain fidelity to Mary Shelley's novel. As we approach the climactic ending of our story, let us recall the full title of Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. In Greek mythology, Prometheus makes a man out of clay and steals fire from the gods in order to bring him to life. As a result, Prometheus suffers unspeakable punishments. A similar story from classical mythology, that of Pygmalion from Ovid's Metamorphoses, may also have inspired Mary Shelley's novel, as she and Percy Shelley were studying Ovid in 1815. The tale of Pygmalion, famously and rather loosely adapted to stage and screen in the 20th century, centers upon a sculptor who carves an ivory statue of a beautiful woman with whom he falls in love. He entreats the goddess Venus to give life to the statue, which she does. Nowhere does Mary Shelley's text mention either of these legends, except in the novel's subtitle. And neither does the Dan Curtis adaptation. Yet, in the final confrontation between Victor and his creation, we see numerous images of each of them framed against Greek or Romanesque statuary, obliquely referencing the tale's mythological dimensions. At the beginning of this scene, each of these characters is out to kill the other. Victor, simply for the sake of trying to undo the damage that he's done in creating the giant in the first place, and the creature is out for revenge, pure and simple. All that changes when Victor falls and injures himself mortally, and the creature realizes that Victor may be about to die, and he says, "Don't die. I can't live without you now." So suddenly their attitudes towards each other change, and the parental instinct of Victor as creator starts to come out. He admits to the creature, "I've failed you. I failed to teach you. I didn't teach you." And then the creature goes into this sort of confessional, admitting the sorrow that he felt when he killed William and Elizabeth, not realizing that Victor himself has passed away in that moment. When he does realize that, we get a very tearful reaction from the monster. So it's a very emotionally satisfying way to end this story. And although the manner of the characters' deaths differs from those in the novel, it has to be this way out of a sense of narrative expediency, right? We can't have, I mean, the novel ends in the Arctic regions on a ship, and, we've already established that this version, as so many others, dispenses with that whole Arctic framing story, but we still need this scene of the deaths of the two characters. And given the fact that it has to take place in a different situation, a different locale, it does maintain the spirit of the original pretty well, I think. Especially the death of the creature. In the novel, the creature goes overboard off the ship voluntarily in a sort of suicidal gesture. And here, as the monster screams at the guards or police, he knows that they're going to shoot at him. And so, again, it's a kind of suicidal self-sacrifice. He knows that he can't go on living in this world. The final moments of Dan Curtis's Frankenstein evoke his 1970 film House of Dark Shadows in a couple of ways, the ending of that film. First of all, the repeated use of Bob Cobert's climactic music in the end. It's the same music that we heard at the end of House of Dark Shadows. It's the same music that ends The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But also, visually speaking, the end of Frankenstein echoes the end of House of Dark Shadows with this high-angle view of a wide frame where the main character, or in this case, characters, have died, and it's a very tragic final moment of the film. And once more, we get this repetition of the line, "Forgive me," bringing back in the theme of forgiveness that had come up earlier in this version of Frankenstein. So it's a very nice way to end the film and wrap up some of the thematic concerns and resolve some of the emotional issues from earlier in the film. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed Dan Curtis's 1973 production of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Once again, my name is Rodney Hill. I'm a professor of film studies in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra University. And if you'll bear with me just for a couple more minutes, I want to acknowledge the people whose work has informed my research in preparing for this commentary. I've drawn pretty heavily on the work of Jim Pearson and Jeff Thompson, both of whom are experts on the life and career and work of Dan Curtis. But I've also drawn on other scholarly sources by people such as Tino Ballio, David Blakesley, Douglas Gomery, Isaka Joshu, Howard Maxford, Laurie Schultz, John Tibbetts, Tom Vallance, and the late Jim Welsh. And I'm very grateful for their work. And now here's one final nod to all the Dark Shadows fans out there. Frankenstein is a Dan Curtis production.